A cruel laugh echoed from the bridge, followed by the chilling splash of a sealed box hitting the freezing river. Inside, three tiny puppies struggled desperately between life and death. But the heartless men made one fatal mistake. They didn't know Owen, a Navy SEAL on leave with his K-9 partner, was watching. Without a single second of hesitation, Owen plunged into the icy current. He knew his peaceful vacation was over, but a fierce battle for justice had just begun. Will the puppies survive the freezing depths? And what happens when a soldier hunts down cruelty? Watch this breathtaking rescue mission to witness the satisfying power of karma. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage. The Winterford River carved through the Montana wilderness like a vein of liquid silver, the morning air biting enough to freeze breath in the lungs, creating a silence so profound it felt heavy against the drifting wooden hull. Owen sat in the center of the drift boat, the rhythmic dip of the oars serving as the only anchor to the present moment. At 38, he carried the physical and mental architecture of a man who had spent too long in the shadows. He was a formidable figure, standing 6'2" with the lean, corded muscle of a predator that never truly rests, even in repose. His hair, a dark brown kept in a regulation-short military cut, was beginning to show premature threads of silver at the temples, a testament to the stress of a life lived in high-stakes environments. His face was a map of his history. A jagged, pale scar ran from his hairline down to his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a shrapnel burst in Kandahar, and his jawline was currently obscured by a week's worth of dark, unkempt stubble. His eyes were the most arresting feature, a piercing steel gray that constantly scanned the perimeter, analyzing threats even here, in the middle of nowhere. He was a man composed of sharp edges and silence, often perceived by others as intimidating or cold, but beneath the hardened exterior lay a reservoir of exhausted grief. He was a Navy SEAL on mandatory leave, forced to step away from the teams after the loss of Miller, his swim buddy and brother in all but blood, who had taken a bullet meant for Owen 3 months ago. The guilt was a physical weight in the boat, heavier than the water around him. Sitting alert at the bow was Bear, a massive 4-year-old sable German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes and a coat that mixed dark blacks and rich tans. Bear was not a pet. He was a multi-purpose canine, a highly trained weapon and tracker who had saved Owen's life more times than he could count. The dog sat with a regal posture, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, occasionally glancing back at Owen with a low whine, sensing the turmoil radiating from his handler. Bear was the only creature Owen trusted completely, the only soul who understood the language of violence and silence they both spoke. Today was supposed to be about healing, about finding a way to lower the heart rate that had been spiking in his sleep, but the tranquility of the river felt like a thin veneer over a chaotic world. Owen tightened his grip on the oars, his knuckles white and scarred, the calluses on his palms scraping against the wood. He took a deep breath, trying to force the image of Miller's blood on the extraction deck out of his mind, trying to convince himself that he was just a man fishing, not a soldier waiting for the next ambush. The illusion of peace shattered in an instant. The sound of a combustion engine growled from the ridge above, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. Owen's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he tracked a rusted, beat-up blue pickup truck skidding to a halt on the old Pine Ridge Bridge that spanned the river 50 yards ahead. 2 men stepped out. They were indistinct from this distance, just silhouettes of malice, wearing heavy flannel jackets and baseball caps, their body language loose and reckless. One of them, a bulky figure with a beer belly that strained his shirt, walked to the bed of the truck and hauled out a large, taping-sealed cardboard box. The other man, thinner and jittery, let out a laugh that echoed off the canyon walls, a sound devoid of warmth, cruel and sharp like breaking glass. Owen stopped rowing, the water dripping from the oars the only sound as he watched, a cold knot forming in his gut. He knew that body language. He had seen it in war zones, the casual disregard for life that evil men wear like a second skin. The heavy-set man lifted the box high over the railing. "Trash!" he yelled, his voice carrying over the water, before he heaved the package into the void. The box plummeted, hitting the surface of the freezing river with a violent slap that sounded like a gunshot. The impact was too much for the wet cardboard. It burst open instantly. Owen's breath hitched. Spilling out into the deadly current were not garbage or debris, but 3 tiny, flailing shapes. They were puppies, German shepherds no older than a few weeks, their fur black and tan like miniature versions of bear. They were too young to swim, too shocked by the freezing cold to do anything but thrash helplessly as the current seized them. The men on the bridge cheered, high-fiving each other before jumping back into their truck and speeding off, leaving death in their wake. A switch flipped inside Owen's brain. The grief, the fatigue, the desire for a vacation, it all evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, burning focus. The civilian was gone. The operator had returned. He looked at the drowning pups, then at Bear, who was already standing at the edge of the boat, muscles coiled. Owen realized with a grim certainty that his vacation was over. There was no time to think, only to act. The decision bypassed Owen's conscious thought process entirely, stemming instead from the muscle memory carved into his neural pathways by years of high-stress warfare where hesitation was synonymous with death. One moment, he was a retired soldier gripping wooden oars. The next, he was a projectile launching into the void. He didn't even take the time to strip off his heavy tactical jacket, knowing that the few seconds required to unzip it would cost the smallest drifting life its only chance at survival. He hit the water with a bone-jarring impact, the Winterford River greeting him not with a splash, but with a thermal shock so violent it felt like being encased in concrete. The water temperature was barely above freezing, a numbing assault that instantly drove the air from his lungs and sent his heart rate spiking into the danger zone. But Owen had been conditioned to function in hellscapes that would break lesser men. He clamped his jaw shut, forcing his diaphragm to expand against the crushing pressure of the cold, and kicked his legs with the powerful rhythmic strokes of a combat swimmer. The current was a living thing, a muscular, serpentine beast that wrestled him for every inch of progress, trying to drag him downstream toward the jagged rocks that lined the canyon bend. His target was the cluster of 2 puppies drifting nearest to the boat, their tiny heads barely bobbing above the whitecaps. They were silent now, the initial shock of the cold having likely seized their vocal cords, their small paws thrashing uselessly against the churn. Owen reached the first one, a frantic ball of wet fur that felt terrifyingly light in his hand. He grabbed it by the scruff of its neck, tucking it securely against his chest to keep its head above water, and immediately pivoted toward the second. The cold was beginning to seep through his layers, a dull ache settling into his bones, reminding him of the ticking clock of hypothermia. He lunged forward, his fingers brushing against the slippery coat of the second pup, just as a swell threatened to pull it under. With a grunt of exertion that expelled a cloud of white vapor into the air, he snagged the second creature, pulling it in tight against the first. He had 2. But there were 3. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in his chest, not for himself, but for the failure that loomed. He treaded water, fighting the relentless push of the river, and whipped his head around, scanning the gray-green turbulence. "Bear!" Owen roared, his voice raw and cracking over the roar of the water. He didn't need to give a command. The bond between handler and K9 was telepathic, forged in the fires of combat patrols and silent nights on watch. On the drifting boat, Bear had been pacing the gunwale, his muscles vibrating with kinetic energy, whining as he watched his master battle the river. When he saw Owen turn and look toward the far bank, toward the deadly eddy swirling near a protruding log, Bear understood. The Itu's third puppy, the smallest of the litter, had been swept wide and was spinning helplessly toward the sucking vortex of a whirlpool created by the submerged debris. Without a sound, the German shepherd launched himself from the boat. He hit the water with a splash that showcased his raw power, his 4 legs churning like pistons. Bear was a strong swimmer, bred for utility and endurance, and he cut through the current with a singular, predatory focus. He wasn't hunting. He was retrieving. Owen watched, heart hammering against his ribs as his dog intercepted the drifting pup just feet before the whirlpool could claim it. Bear lowered his head, the water lapping over his snout, and opened his powerful jaws. With the tenderness of a mother, he utilized the soft mouth technique he had been trained for in retrieval exercises, gently clamping down on the loose skin at the back of the puppy's neck. He secured the tiny, limp body, turned his massive head upstream, and began the grueling swim back toward the rocky shoreline where Owen was already hauling himself out. Owen scrambled up the slick, moss-covered river stones, his boots heavy with water, his movement sluggish as the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the shivering onset of the cold. He dropped the first 2 puppies onto the dry grass, checking their airways instantly. They were breathing, shallow, raspy gasps, but breathing. He turned back just as Bear found his footing in the shallows. The great dog shook the water from his coat, a spray of diamonds in the cold sun, and trotted up the bank to deposit the 3rd puppy at Owen's feet. The runt was motionless, a sodden lump of fur. Owen fell to his knees, ignoring the rocks biting into his shins, and began to vigorously rub the small chest, using his large, calloused thumbs to stimulate the heart. "Come on," he whispered, his voice trembling, seeing Miller's face for a split second in the darkness of his memory. "Not today. Nobody dies today." The puppy coughed, a tiny hacking sound, and retched up a mouthful of river water. It let out a weak, high-pitched mewl. Owen slumped back, exhaling a breath he felt he had been holding for 3 months. He looked at Bear, who was standing over them, dripping wet and panting, his amber eyes filled with an intelligent concern. They were all alive. Wet, freezing, and terrified, but alive. The interior of Owen's hillside cabin was a study in utilitarian isolation, a space designed for a man who required little more than shelter and silence to exist. The walls were rough-hewn pine, unadorned save for a few topographic maps of the surrounding wilderness and a gun rack that held a hunting rifle and a compound bow. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, and within minutes of their frantic arrival, Owen had coaxed a roaring blaze from a stack of seasoned oak, the heat radiating outward to combat the lingering chill of the river. The 3 puppies were huddled together in a makeshift nest of thick wool blankets on the rug before the hearth, their small bodies shivering violently as their core temperatures fought to stabilize. Owen knelt beside them, his movements precise and methodical, stripped of his wet gear and now wearing a dry thermal Henley that clung to his broad shoulders. He worked with the focus of a combat medic, drying their fur with rough towels, checking for lacerations, broken bones, or signs of shock. Bear lay mere inches away, his head resting on his front paws, his amber eyes fixed unblinkingly on the new arrivals, emitting a low, vibrating rumble of concern every time one of the puppies whimpered. As the shivering of the 2 larger pups began to subside into exhausted sleep, Owen turned his attention to a detailed physical inspection. He picked up the largest of the trio, a male with oversized paws that suggested he would grow to be a formidable animal. As Owen gently manipulated the pup's head to check its eyes, his thumb brushed against the inner flap of the left ear. The skin felt wrong, ridged and thickened. Frowning, Owen angled the puppy's head toward the firelight to get a better look. What he saw made his blood run cold, a chill far deeper than the river water had inflicted. There, seared into the delicate pink skin of the inner ear, was a crude, jagged brand. It wasn't a tattoo or a microchip scar. It was a heat burn, scarring the tissue in the shape of a letter and a number. R7. The mark was raw, likely only a few days old, infected at the edges. Owen felt a surge of nausea mixed with a dark, rising anger. He quickly checked the 2nd puppy, a female. She bore the same mark, R7. He checked the 3rd, the runt, R7. This wasn't the work of a careless backyard owner or a random act of cruelty by drunk teenagers. This was organized. A brand implied inventory. It implied a system where living creatures were graded, marked, and in this case, discarded like defective merchandise. Owen's analysis was cut short by a terrifying sound from the pile of blankets. The runt, the smallest puppy, the one Bear had pulled from the edge of the whirlpool, began to wheeze. It wasn't the soft whimper of a cold dog. It was a wet, rattling sound, like air bubbling through fluid. Owen dropped the towel and scooped the tiny creature up. Its body, which had been shivering moments ago, was now limp and ominously still. He pressed his ear to the pup's chest and heard the telltale crackle of fluid in the lungs. Aspiration pneumonia, setting in with lethal speed from the river water it had inhaled. He pulled back the pup's lip. The gums were pale, bordering on blue. Cyanosis. The animal was suffocating, its immature immune system crashing under the shock and infection. "Damn it!" Owen hissed, his voice tight. He rubbed the puppy's ribcage vigorously, trying to stimulate the heart, trying to clear the airways, but the small golden eyes were rolling back, glazing over with the fog of approaching death. The peaceful warmth of the cabin suddenly felt suffocating. The fire too slow, the isolation a death sentence. "We're moving," Owen announced to the empty room. He didn't waste time packing supplies. He grabbed the entire bundle of wool blankets, scooping all 3 puppies into a secure, taco-like wrap, keeping the struggling runt pressed against the warmth of his own chest. He grabbed his keys and a heavy flashlight, kicking the door open into the twilight. The sun had dipped below the tree line, leaving the world in a wash of bruised purples and grays. Bear was already at the door of Owen's black Ford F-150, barking once, sharp and commanding. Owen placed the bundle on the passenger seat, cranking the heater to the maximum setting before the engine even turned over. As the truck roared to life, tires spinning on the gravel before finding purchase, Owen looked down at the runt. The puppy's breathing was shallow, a desperate gasp for life. The R7 brand on its ear seemed to mock him in the dashboard lights, a symbol of a cruel authority that had decided this life was worth nothing. Owen slammed the truck into gear, his jaw set in a line of granite. He wasn't just saving a dog anymore. He was declaring war on whoever held the branding iron. The drive to the nearest town, Willow Creek, usually took 40 minutes. Owen intended to make it in 20. The Willow Creek Veterinary Clinic was a modest, single-story brick building situated at the edge of town, its white paint peeling slightly under the harsh Montana elements. But the emergency sign buzzing in neon red above the door offered a beacon of desperate hope in the black night. Owen didn't bother parking neatly. He slewed the Ford F-150 sideways across 2 spots, the tires crunching loudly on the gravel, and was out of the cab before the engine fully died, the bundle of blankets cradled in his arms like a volatile explosive. Bear leaped out behind him, a shadow detached from the darkness, flanking his handler with silent, protective intensity. Owen kicked the glass door open, shouting for help, his voice cracking the sterile silence of the waiting room. Dr. Sarah Vance emerged from the back hallway almost instantly, alerted by the commotion. Sarah was a woman who wore her 36 years not with vanity, but with a rugged, utilitarian grace. She was tall, nearly 5'10", with a slender but wiry build that spoke of long days wrestling livestock and lifting heavy crates. Her hair was a deep, burnished auburn, currently pulled back into a severe, messy bun that allowed loose tendrils to frame a face defined by high cheekbones and a dusting of freckles across a nose that had been broken once, likely by a horse. Her eyes were her most striking feature, a sharp, piercing hazel that held a mixture of deep compassion and a weary, cynical hardness, the look of someone who had seen too much suffering to be easily shocked. She wore a stained blue scrub top and a white lab coat that had seen better days, smelling faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Unlike many who shrank from Owen's imposing, scarred presence, Sarah didn't flinch. She took one look at the frantic seal and the bundle in his arms, her gaze shifting instantly to the blue-tinged muzzle of the smallest puppy visible through the folds of the wool and snapped into professional mode. "Treatment Room 1. Now," she commanded, her voice raspy but authoritative, turning on her heel without waiting for a response. Inside the exam room, the air was sharp with the smell of rubbing alcohol and latex. Sarah worked with a speed that mirrored Owen's own combat efficiency. She laid the puppies out on the stainless steel table, immediately intubating the smallest one, the runt Owen had mentally named Tiny, hooking it up to an oxygen concentrator and a heating pad. "Aspiration pneumonia," she diagnosed flatly, her hands moving in a blur as she injected a broad-spectrum antibiotic and a diuretic to help clear the fluid from the lungs. Only when the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor steadied from a frantic erraticism to a tenuous rhythm did she slow down. She began the secondary examination of the other two pups, cleaning their fur. It was then, as she swabbed the ear of the largest male, that her movements froze. Her fingers tightened around the puppy's ear flap, revealing the jagged R7 brand. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale beneath the fluorescent lights. She looked at the second pup, then the third. "Damn them," she whispered, a curse that sounded more like a prayer for vengeance. She looked up at Owen, her hazel eyes dark with a sudden terrified recognition. "Owen, where exactly did you find these?" "Thrown off Pine Ridge Bridge," Owen replied, his voice low, watching her reaction closely. "Two men. Pickup truck. They laughed." Sarah let out a shaky breath, leaning back against the counter as if the weight of the situation physically pushed her. "I knew it," she murmured. "I hoped I was wrong, but this confirms it." She gestured to the angry red brand on the puppy's ear. "This isn't a random act of cruelty, Owen. This is a serial number. R stands for reject. 7 is the batch number." She crossed her arms, hugging herself defensively. "There's a legend around here, something the locals whisper about but never confirm, an illegal breeding compound deep in the Ghostwood Forest. They aren't breeding pets, they're breeding war machines. High-aggression German shepherds and pit bull mixes for underground fighting rings and other illicit exports. If a puppy shows fear or weakness or kindness, like these little ones likely did, they are branded reject and disposed of." Owen's jaw tightened, his mind racing. "If you know this, why haven't the police shut them down?" Sarah let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "I tried," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. 3 months ago, a mutilated dog was dumped near my clinic with an R6 brand. I saved him. I took the photos, the evidence, everything to Sheriff Higgins. 2 days later, my clinic was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but a single bullet was left on my appointment book. And Higgins? He told me I had an overactive imagination and that I should stick to fixing house cats if I wanted to stay in business." She looked Owen dead in the eye, her fear replaced by a simmering rage. "The local law isn't just ignoring this, Owen. They are protecting it. These puppies are evidence of a multi-million-dollar operation, and anyone who gets close to it disappears or gets silenced." Owen looked down at the 3 sleeping puppies, then at Bear, who was standing guard at the door, a low growl rumbling in his throat as if he sensed the unseen enemy. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just animal abuse, it was a fortified criminal enterprise with cover from the very people sworn to stop it. The decision to leave Bear behind was one of the hardest tactical choices Owen had made since leaving the teams, but his logic was cold and ironclad. The local law enforcement was compromised. The clinic was a soft target, and Sarah was a civilian with a target on her back. Bear wasn't just a dog, he was a deterrent, a kinetic weapon that could hold a perimeter against anyone foolish enough to come back for the evidence. "Guard," Owen commanded, his voice low and vibrating with a finality that Bear understood instantly. The great shepherd whined once, a high-pitched sound of protest that died in his throat as he looked from Owen to Sarah, then settled his massive frame in front of the clinic door, his amber eyes shifting to a hard, unblinking watch. Sarah stood with her arms crossed, shivering slightly not from cold, but from adrenaline. "You come back," she said, her voice tight. "That's not a request." Owen didn't smile. He had forgotten how to do that months ago. But he gave a curt nod, checked the knife strapped to his thigh, and vanished into the consuming darkness of the Montana night. He left his truck miles back, camouflaged down a logging road, and moved on foot into the Ghostwood Forest, a sprawling expanse of dense pine and craggy ravines that locals avoided after sundown. The forest was a sensory deprivation tank of shadows and biting wind, but for Owen it was a familiar office. He moved with the predatory silence of a man who had spent a decade hunting high-value targets in the Hindu Kush. He didn't use a flashlight. His eyes, adjusted to the gloom, read the terrain through shifts in contrast and texture. He followed the tire tracks he had mentally catalogued earlier, the distinct tread pattern of the rusted blue pickup. The air grew heavier the deeper he went, the clean scent of pine giving way to something acrid and metallic, the smell of fear, bleach, and old blood. After an hour of navigating the treacherous incline of a ravine, he saw it. Nestled in a natural depression that blocked it from the main road was a sprawling, dilapidated compound. It looked like an abandoned logging camp, centered around a massive, corrugated metal warehouse that was rusted through in patches, leaking slivers of yellow artificial light into the night. A chain-link fence topped with razor wire perimetered the site, but Owen identified 3 blind spots in the first 30 seconds of observation. He ghosted closer, sliding into the cover of a fallen redwood, his breathing shallow and controlled. Through the dirty plexiglass of a side window and the gaps in the rotting wood, Owen confirmed the intel. The courtyard was patrolled by 2 men, the same 2 he had seen on the bridge. Up close, their features were distinct and repulsive. The heavier one, the man who had thrown the box, was a towering slab of unhealthy fat named Tiny by his cohorts, though there was nothing small about him. He had a shaved head glistening with sweat despite the cold, a thick neck that spilled over his collar, and a face dominated by a broken nose and small, piggish eyes that scanned the darkness with dull malice. He carried a pump-action shotgun slung carelessly over his shoulder. The second man, the one with the cruel laugh, was wiry and twitchy, likely on methamphetamines. He had a gaunt, rat-like face, stringy blonde hair that hung in greasy curtains, and sores visible on his hands as he lit a cigarette. He wore a pistol tucked into his waistband. They weren't soldiers, they were thugs, undisciplined and loud, laughing as they kicked at the cages lining the exterior wall. But it was what lay inside the warehouse that made Owen's blood boil, threatening to override his discipline. He crept to a ventilation gap, raising his smartphone to record through the slats. The interior was a house of horrors. Dozens of cages were stacked against the walls, filled with German shepherds, pit bulls, and Rottweilers. Some were barking manically, throwing themselves against the bars. Others were cowering in the back, broken and silent. In the center of the room was a breaking pit, a plywood ring stained dark with fluids. Owen's camera focused on a terrifying piece of machinery, a slat mill treadmill where a gaunt, exhausted dog was being forced to run, chained by its neck so it couldn't stop without hanging itself. The reject brand, the R7, was visible on a whiteboard near the office door, listing inventory. This wasn't just a few rednecks fighting dogs, it was a factory. Owen recorded it all, the faces of the men, the suffering of the animals, the weapons, the layout. He had the evidence to bury them, but as he watched the rat-faced man strike a cowering dog with a metal rod, the urge to intervene right then and there was a physical pain. But he was one man with a knife against a fortified position with unknown numbers inside. He needed the hammer, not just the scalpel. He lowered the phone, saving the file that would end them, and began the slow, agonizing retreat back into the shadows. Owen retreated to the tree line, his breath misting in the freezing air, the glow of the smartphone screen illuminating his grim expression as he dialed a number he hadn't used in 2 years. The situation had escalated. Through the gaps in the fence, he saw the heavy transport truck, a cattle hauler caked in mud, backing up to the warehouse doors. They were flushing the inventory. He needed a hammer, and he needed it now. The line picked up on the second ring. "This line is dead, Owen," a gravelly voice answered instantly. It was Special Agent Marcus Thorne, a man Owen had served with in Fallujah before Thorne traded his trident for an FBI badge. Thorne was a bulldog of a man, relentless and by the book, but he owed Owen a debt of blood that could never be fully repaid. "I'm sending you a location, Marcus," Owen said, his voice devoid of pleasantries. "Active criminal enterprise, dogfighting ring, interstate trafficking. Local law is compromised. I'm going in." Thorne didn't ask for details. He heard the tone in Owen's voice, the tone of a reaper. "ETA, 40 minutes with state TAC. Do not engage unless necessary, Owen." Owen hung up. 40 minutes was too long. By then, the truck would be gone, and the evidence would vanish into the dark web of the underworld. He made the run back to the clinic in record time, skidding the truck to a halt. He didn't explain much to Sarah, just met her eyes with a look that promised violence and justice. "I need him," Owen said, nodding at the dog. Sarah opened the door, and Bear trotted out, sensing the shift in his master's energy. The dog was no longer the gentle guardian. His posture had stiffened, his ears pinned back, his tail low. He was a weapon now. They drove back to the perimeter of the logging road, approaching the camp on foot from the windward side to mask their scent. Owen outlined the plan with hand signals that Bear followed with uncanny precision. This wasn't a rescue anymore. It was an assault. They moved like phantoms through the underbrush, reaching the rear of the massive cattle hauler idling near the loading dock. Owen produced his combat knife, the matte black blade disappearing into the darkness as he systematically slashed the valve stems and severed the hydraulic brake lines of the trailer. Hissing air and fluid sprayed onto the frozen mud. The transport was dead in the water. Next came the distraction. Owen rigged a crude incendiary using a discarded canister of diesel and a road flare found in the truck bed, tossing it toward the far side of the perimeter fence. The resulting whoosh of flame and sudden light caused panic. "Fire! Over by the generator!" someone shouted. The guards, including the hulking Tiny, ran toward the blaze. That left the rear unguarded. Owen signaled Bear. They breached the side door. Inside, the warehouse was a chaotic scene of barking dogs and shouting men. The rat-faced man from the bridge was trying to drag a resisting pit bull into a crate. He never saw Owen coming. Owen moved with terrifying speed, stepping out of the shadows and applying a rear naked choke. The man thrashed for 3 seconds before going limp, dropped silently to the concrete floor. Bear stood over him, a low rumble in his chest, daring anyone else to approach. Suddenly, the metal door of the office at the top of the catwalk banged open. A man stepped out, looking incongruous amidst the filth and squalor. This was Silas Vane, the architect of this misery. Vane was in his late 50s, a man who exuded a cold, reptilian charisma. He was dressed not in flannel or tactical gear, but in a tailored charcoal wool coat and a silk scarf. His silver hair slicked back with meticulous precision. His face was unlined but pale, his eyes the color of dirty ice, lacking any spark of humanity. He didn't look like a dog fighter, he looked like a CEO of a slaughterhouse. He held a clipboard in one hand and looked down at Owen with a sneer of arrogant annoyance rather than fear. "You're trespassing on private property," Vane announced, his voice smooth and cultured, echoing in the cavernous space. "And you have cost me a great deal of money tonight." "It's over, Vane," Owen called out, stepping into the light, his hands raised to show he wasn't holding a firearm, trying to keep Vane's attention while Bear circled through the shadows of the crates. "Federal agents are 10 minutes out. The truck isn't moving. Give it up." Vane chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "The law in this county works for me, soldier. You're just a nuisance." He raised his hands in a mock gesture of surrender, his eyes locking onto Owen's. "Fine, let's discuss terms." As he spoke, Vane's right hand drifted casually behind the lapel of his expensive coat. Owen saw the shift in the man's shoulder, the telltale twitch of a draw. "Bear!" Owen shouted, but the dog was already airborne. Just as Vane whipped out a compact silver pistol, a black and tan missile slammed into him. Bear's jaws clamped onto Vane's forearm with the crushing force of a hydraulic press. Vane screamed, the gun clattering to the metal grating as he was knocked backward over the railing, crashing onto a stack of hay bales below. Bear landed atop him, teeth bared inches from Vane's throat, holding the man pinned with terrifying, absolute control. Outside, the night was suddenly pierced by the wail of sirens and the blue and red strobes of the state police cutting through the trees. The flashing red and blue lights of the state police cruisers painted the ghostwood trees in a surreal, strobing rhythm, cutting through the darkness that had shrouded the compound for years. The dismantling of Silas Vane's empire was swift and absolute. FBI agents, led by the imposing figure of Special Agent Marcus Thorne, swarmed the facility, cataloging evidence and coordinating the transport of over 40 traumatized dogs to safe shelters across the state. But the most satisfying image for Owen wasn't the dismantling of the cages or the seizure of Vane's assets. It was the sight of Sheriff Higgins, the man who had turned a blind eye to torture for a paycheck, being led away in handcuffs. Higgins, a man whose physical description was a caricature of gluttony and corruption, with a ruddy, gin-blossomed complexion and a uniform that strained against his bulk, looked small and defeated, stripped of his authority. He refused to meet Sarah Vance's gaze as he was shoved into the back of a patrol car. Sarah stood by the open doors of the animal transport van, her face smeared with grime and exhaustion, yet glowing with a fierce, quiet victory. She was directing the triage of the animals, her voice hoarse but steady. For the first time in months, the shadows under her eyes didn't look like despair. They looked like the cost of a battle won. 3 weeks later, the harsh Montana winter began to recede, the snow on the riverbanks giving way to patches of vibrant green grass and the scent of thawing earth. The Willow Creek Veterinary Clinic had transformed from a place of desperate emergency to a sanctuary of recovery. In the recovery ward, the 3 shepherd puppies had become the clinic's mascots. The 2 larger pups had already been spoken for, adopted by a state trooper and a retired schoolteacher who had heard the news story. But the 3rd one, the runt Owen had pulled from the whirlpool, remained. He had fought a brutal battle against pneumonia, spending days in an oxygen tent, his tiny ribs heaving with every breath. But he had the heart of a fighter. He was no longer a limp, dying thing. He was a ball of chaotic energy, his fur growing in thick and soft, the R7 brand on his ear fading into a scar that would eventually be covered by his coat. When Owen walked into the clinic, the change in the atmosphere was palpable. He wasn't there to investigate or fight. He was there to complete a mission of a different sort. Sarah looked up from her chart, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "He's been waiting for you," she said simply, nodding toward the playpen. Owen knelt down, and the runt, who they had taken to calling Tiny, despite the fact that his paws suggested he would grow into a giant, scrambled over the plastic barrier. Tiny tumbled into Owen's lap, chewing enthusiastically on the zipper of Owen's jacket, yipping with a high-pitched joy that filled the room. Bear, who had been sitting stoically by the door, walked over and lowered his massive head. Tiny froze for a second, then fearlessly swatted at Bear's nose. Bear didn't growl. He simply sneezed and gave the puppy a rough, affectionate lick that nearly knocked him over. "He's a survivor, Owen," Sarah said, leaning against the doorframe. "Just like you." Owen looked down at the puppy, tracing the faint line of the scar on its ear. He signed the adoption papers with a hand that felt lighter than it had in years. "Not Tiny," Owen murmured, looking at the dog's fiery spirit. "Rotor." A nod to the helicopter extraction teams that brought soldiers home, a symbol of being lifted out of the fire. The final scene of their journey took place on the porch of Owen's cabin, overlooking the Winterford River where it all began. The sun was high and warm, turning the rushing water into a ribbon of light rather than a cold grave. Owen sat in his Adirondack chair, a mug of coffee in his hand, the steam rising in the crisp air. The silence of the wilderness was no longer heavy or haunting. It was peaceful. In the yard, Bear lay in a patch of sunlight, tolerating the antics of Rotor, who was currently trying to drag a stick 3 times his size across the grass. Every time Rotor stumbled, he got back up, shaking himself off and charging forward again. Owen watched them, and for the first time in 3 months, the image of Miller dying on the extraction deck didn't overlap with the present. The guilt that had been a constant, suffocating weight in his chest had loosened, replaced by a sense of quiet purpose. He realized that in the freezing water that day, he hadn't just pulled 3 dogs from death, he had pulled himself back from the brink. He had found a reason to endure, to protect, to live. The darkness of the world was still there, lurking in places like the Ghostwood Forest, but as long as there were those willing to stand in the gap to jump into the cold water, the light would hold. Owen took a sip of coffee, smiled, a real, true smile that reached his eyes, and called out, "Bear, Rotor, heel." As the 2 dogs, one a scarred veteran and one a clumsy new recruit, ran toward him, Owen knew he was finally home. Miracles often arrive not in grand gestures, but in the faintest heartbeat of a discarded life refusing to fade. Owen believed he was the savior that freezing morning on the Winterford River, but in truth, God works in mysterious ways, often using the smallest, most fragile creatures to heal the broken souls of the strongest men. We all face cold currents in our daily lives, moments where we feel unworthy or forgotten, but this story serves as a testament that we are never truly abandoned. Redemption is always within reach, and sometimes saving another is the only way to save yourself. If this story of resilience and divine second chances touched your heart, please share it to spread the light. Subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. May God bless you and your families, guiding you safely through every storm you face.